Hello everyone, and welcome to the virtual Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, where today we're talking about encounters in Greek and Irish literature with Paschalis Nikolaou of the Ionian University in Corfu and our very own Deirdre Madden of the Oscar Wilde Centre here at Trinity College Dublin. So just before I hand over to them, I'd like to give you a little bit of housekeeping. So as you know, we're on Zoom today, and we are welcoming your questions, especially, and our speakers will give you the answers to as many of those questions as possible. If you'd like to ask a question at any point during the talk, you don't have to wait until the end. Please do use the chat box function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So you just click there, and then you can type away at any point, and we'll try to get through as many of those questions as we can. Please don't unmute yourself during the event, and I hope you enjoy it. So I'll just pass it over to Paschalis and Deirdre Madden.
Hello, everybody. Hi. And thank you all very much. This is Deirdre. Thank you all for very much for coming today to attend this event. I'd like to begin by welcoming Paschalis very much. I do regret that we can't welcome him in person to Trinity to talk about his book. But I am relieved and delighted that we are able to do a virtual event here today. It's based on a conference which a wonderful conference which Paschalis organised in 2017. He teaches translation in the Ionian University and organised this most unusual conference. And there's a clue in the title of the book of why it was so unusual in the subtitle, Creativity, Translations and Critical Perspectives. So I'm going to, there is a sort of mixture of creative writing. Writers were invited, also translators, Paschalis' translation students. I'd like to ask you, Paschalis, to tell us a little bit about the conference on which the book is based. Could you tell us a little bit about it, how it came about, how you organized it?
Absolutely. Deirdre, thank you for this introduction, and James as well. And it would be difficult to be with you even without the pandemic, and even if I was in, because I'm not in Europe. So I'm taking part here from Columbus, Ohio. I'm in the States, and it's actually 8 o'clock here in the morning. So there's a bit of a time difference as well. Thank you again for the invitation, and it's good to be part of this series of events of lunchtime readings. Deirdre, you were there, so it's I'm doubly happy to see you and have this this event happening in collaboration with you. It's wonderful to see you again and to remind ourselves as well what happened 3 years ago. So. What I would say is this: I'm part of a department of translation, interpreting. I've been there more than 10 years. We always want to have conferences take place. We want our students to sort of be part of this community and to enter research as well beyond just working on translations and entering the market. So I'm always vigilant about such possibilities. Now in Corfu as well, because I wasn't the organizer of this, the sole organizer of this event. I was the co-organizer. Richard Pine, of the who is sort of an expert, a researcher of Durrell, Lawrence Durrell, is based in Corfu for nearly 20 years. So he was in touch with the Irish embassy, in touch with the British Council. He had some contacts there, and he wanted to do a literary festival. So eventually, we discussed the possibility of joining forces, so to speak. And we came up with the idea of, I mean, if I would be organizing this, it would be a, you know, your typical, I don't know if I could use this word, a typical translation conference. He wanted to invite Irish authors to Corfu and to have a festival. What eventually transpired was a hybrid, a more ambitious hybrid event. And I was overjoyed about this possibility, because we would also be able to have our students actively take part as translators and participate in a situation that they would normally encounter afterwards. I mean, we always want to bring them in contact with authors, with publishers, with the market in all sorts of ways that we can. So this was a unique opportunity. Ideally, let me put it this way. Ideally, we would want to organize an event like this once a year, if we could. And in some universities, I mean, in my case, it's a small, it's a great university, but it's a small university. It's not in Athens, it's not in Thessaloniki. It's, you know, it's a great place, but it's Corfu. So it's not exactly central. And it's not exactly a very, you know, rich university. But I do recall, I mean, I did my MA and PhD in East Anglia. And part of the reason I chose to study there was because they had a literary festival at UEA in Norwich. And I wanted to study literary translation. And they had this incredible creative writing MA and tradition there for almost 2 decades, 2 or 3 decades by the time I got there. So I was always sensitive to context and it was a great experience for me. Obviously, I was nearly there in every book launch and every presentation by authors. And there was a literary festival. In fact, every semester, there were 2 literary festivals a year, in a sense. So you had like 2, you know, a set of 8 authors in the autumn, 8 authors in, or less, in the spring. So I was always sensitive. I knew that it did wonders for my confidence and my abilities and my sense of identity as a translator. So I was always wary of trying to find context that we could have this sort of situation for our students if we could. And it's not comparable in scale, our university to UEA or the American universities, but this was one of these opportunities, that festival. So let me quickly show you also the, let me see.
Yes,
yes. So this is what happened. I mean, I have a few slides here, but I mean, we won't be using all of them. There's a few quotes. I mostly wanted to give a sense of the trajectory from towards the festival itself and then towards the book. What we did, and let me also say this, from this vantage point now, after a year of online seminars and the pandemic and all the difficulties that come with it, I'm more appreciative of the fact that we even managed to organize something of this scale, of this sort of complexity, because it wasn't, as I said, we tried to fulfill both of our desires, mine and Richard Pine's. So we wanted to concoct an event that somehow suggested the whole nexus of relationships between writers, I mean novelists in this case. So we restricted ourselves in that respect, at least. So we invited only prose writers instead of, you know, poets, or there were essays, there were papers on drama as well, but it was mostly, I mean, we restricted ourselves in that sense alone. Beyond that, we wanted also the writers not just to do a reading, but to also reflect on their own process and their own work. So we asked them, you can see the 8 names here on the poster on the left. We asked them to provide us with a reflective piece of, something that they could read for 15-20 minutes. And the first day of the event was just that. That's how we opened. Then on the second day and the third day, there was a combination of workshops and seminars and papers delivered by a selection of, there were a few colleagues at the Ionian University as well. So we had people giving papers on the reception of these modern Greek authors, and also folks in Irish studies who contributed as well perspectives, critical perspectives on. So there was an academic side to. It was a literary festival. You can see the subtitle. There's a literary festival celebrating Greek. You have the word celebrating there as well. So it doesn't seem like an academic event, but it was also that. And also we made arrangements with nearly all of the authors to collaborate with the students who had already been working on translations by that point for several months. So there were workshops by the authors delivered and led to our students, and there were the reflective pieces, and we also had the academic side of things. There were even musical events. There was a reception by the ambassador of I don't remember her name now. I don't know if Deirdre, you recall
not. It's
but the previous ambassador of Ireland. So she was there as well. Mm-hmm. So there was it was a combination of and a very even on the reading itself, the readings. There was an afternoon of readings, and even there we tried to somehow. To begin with, the fact that you had readings with the academic component and all the other elements there, that was already ambitious in itself. But we also wanted to have originals and translations as part of the readings. That didn't work always in every single of the readings, but it was in theory. What we tried to do was we had each of our participating authors read from their own work for about 20 minutes in the original language. And let me just, in case it's not clear by now, obviously it's a bilingual setting in all senses of the word, because you have writers who write in Greek and in English, and being translated into the other side of that language pair. So what we tried to do was to have the translator also be present, and we selected students who would rise at a certain point in the reading and would deliver part of the text, of the author's text, in the translation. So they would stand up from the side of the audience and they would contribute for a few sentences, maybe for a paragraph, would contribute the translated text before the author returned to their original. Now, like I said, it didn't always work as beautifully as the idea we had in mind, but it kind of presents the challenges, the difficulties, and the sort of the coordination that had to occur as well. So I don't know if Deirdre, did I give a sort of a adequate
absolutely
picture of what took place.
Absolutely. I think that gives a very good sense of what an unusual and what a very special conference this was. And again, seeing the book cover and the poster there for people as well. It was, I mean, I'm possibly speaking out of turn as a creative writer in saying this, but sometimes books of conference papers, I think, can be very dull and dry. And this one is exceptional because it's so varied. There's so many different angles in it. There's a really marvelous essay about affinities between Ireland and Greece by the Polish academic Joanna Kruszkowska, who also attended the conference. And there's that lovely mix. There's some creative writing. There's fiction by Irish writers such as myself. There's fiction from Greek writers. There are translations, as Paschalis has said, of those. There's the reflections that the writers produced, and then there's the transcription of the round table. There's a wonderful essay on JOYCE and the Greeks by Fran O'Rourke as well, talking about the relationship and how important Greece was to JOYCE. I want to ask you, Paschalis, himself.
Here's a quote from that essay, by the way, while you ask the question, Deirdre, so people can see. There's a couple of, again, I mean, I've prepared a few slides, but it's not a conference, it's not an academic, so you won't see page numbers or anything. It's just to give an idea of how, some a sample of the variety that Deirdre mentioned as well.
Of the work, yes. Paschalis himself has an essay in the book, and he says many of the spaces in which writers and translators move are shared, and in fact many skills are shared as well. And I thought that was a really perceptive remark, and I'm going to ask Paschalis to elaborate on it, but just before he does, I want also to read a little extract from one of the Greek novelists who was there, Sophia Nikolaidou, and she has an author's note on translation. It's very short. I'll just read it out, and then Paschalis, you might comment on that connection between writers and translators. Sophia said, "Translators are also writers. They must rebuild phrases, structure, scenes. We ask of them to transfer a cohesive literary world from one cultural context to another. In the process, they often rewrite parts of the text and subtext. They remodel its rhythms. A translator reconfirms the narrative. He or she identifies and reproduces tone in a novel. I personally view translation as a special type of editing. The style and structure of the original may shift, yet with the purpose of creating the same intellectual, aesthetic, and emotional impact for the reader. Thus, a good translator shares some qualities with a good editor, absorbing a writer's style rather than imposing their own, suggesting minor changes, proposing solutions to issues that agree with the novelist's stated objectives." So Paschalis, could you comment on this interrelation between writers and translators, please?
Deirdre, no, I'm not sure if I should. I mean, she said it all. That's a very
yes.
Let me comment. Let me say this. The fact that a writer is so aware, so sensitive to that itself is proof of the point that you raised at the beginning. That someone like Nikolaidou, and that happens not necessarily because she has worked as a translator. Some authors have done that. I mean, so you have, and some translators have done the opposite. So you are aware of the emphasis with an E of the other's sort of key abilities through having doubled. Maybe you don't have a career, maybe you're not, recognized as you know, you don't have the prestige or the identity in the foreground. Let me put it this way. But you've doubled in it enough to be aware of what the challenges and what kind of talents are required. Let me say this. So the fact that an author like Nikolaidou would give you this paragraph in her reflective piece that I could have written as a translation theorist maybe, and she can go through that sort of detail, and she has that sort of empathy for the translator's perspective.
Yes, yes.
That in itself is remarkable. Beyond that, there's hardly anything there to disagree with. There's what I would add is that we also talk about settings, you know, contact with publishers, with editors. In a translator would, in my case at least, I mean, I remember trying to do this even before I became a translator, even before I became a student of translation. A translator will be drawn to a literary festival, to book launches, to book presentations. It's part of it's a process of osmosis and of attuning yourself to the task to be completed, and maybe a part of you desires both identities, desires both activities. So in different stages and in different, say, levels of skill, perhaps, you will try both and you will be sensitive to both. And so far as I can tell, Nikolaidou has not translated something from English to Greek, say. So the fact that she can articulate these thoughts without even having any translation activity, you can imagine how someone who truly has both identities, and there are many, you know, I know of many Greek authors who will publish a novel once every 2 years and 3 translated books, say, of modern American or British novelists in that same period of time. So yes. It doesn't, one identity, sometimes we discuss, we say literary translators and writers, poets, novelists. Too often the two coexist in the same mind and the same person. It's not a theoretic, it's not a hypothesis that we somehow draw conclusions from. It is actually a reality. They do often, these people occupy the same spaces and the same have the same contacts and the same desires even.
Yes, I completely agree, and I think that by reading out that passage, I will have shown to the audience some of the riches that are to be found in this book, and also I think what you sort of, what I would take as well from what you said, something I've often felt myself, Paschalis, that translators can sometimes be the sort of Cinderella of the literary world, yet they're so important. You know, what the sort of gatekeepers between language, they need to have a very advanced literary sensibility, obviously a tremendous linguistic knowledge in both the language they're translating from and the language that they're translating into. And I don't think that they get enough credit for that. They are creating a new text which is based on the original text. And to some extent, writers are at their mercy. And I don't think this is discussed enough. And that was one of the things that I really enjoyed and found fascinating at the conference, is to really foreground that. And I would imagine for your students, it was tremendous to really look, as you said, the business side of things as well, but also just to engage with practicing writers. And I'm interested and you know, I think it's great that you did your translation studies at UEA, where I also did my MA in creative writing. And we could maybe talk a bit about that. You know, that it is, I think, a useful thing for translators, and especially like people who are training to be a translator, or people who are studying, say, either your students or in the Centre for Literary Translation, under whose auspices this event is taking place. I think it's very helpful for them to do a little bit of creative work themselves. And I'll give you an analogy on that. People sometimes say to me about teaching, people sometimes disregard translators, but they can also be very hard on teaching creative writing. And they say, what's the point? You can't really teach creative writing. The majority of your students will not go on to publish. And I would say, even if people don't go on to publish, even if people don't go on to become writers, I think people who engage very fully with creative writing and really attempt it very well, they'll never see literature in the same way again. It's like if you attempt to draw or paint, even if you're not good at it, you have no real aptitude, you will never look at paintings again. You will learn how to look at objects and look at things in a different way. And I think it's very valid on that point. Paschalis, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah,
or just pick that up?
It trains one to read. I mean, translation is an active, more intense kind of reading. That's I mean, so many times that experience bears this out. I mean, so many times I thought that I can see what this poem is about, and the moment that you're trying to go from one line to the next and render something from English to Greek or vice versa, then you realize that the density of the material that you're trying to, and the full range of the possible intentions of the poet or the author. So that already is a skill that is further developed through activities, the translator being also a writer and the writer also trying to translate. So the thing is, it's helpful. That's society overall. It's not just the field that we're discussing today. It's helpful and practical to think in categories and compartmentalize identity. So we're talking, this is a translator, this is the author, there is so much fluidity and between these identities. It's remarkable. I mean, to begin with, I mean, we already suggested that the translator is also a critic. He or she needs to be. There is no, on a practical level, he or she needs to be. There's too many books out there. You cannot translate all of them. You cannot, I mean, in the exchanges taking place between two literary traditions, there is a selection process. I mean, there's only so many translators and an incredible amount of books. So statistics and numbers force us to become critics and to select and to make value judgments. You have to, I mean, some of these judgments will be subjective. For instance, I cannot claim myself that I'm being, that in my own translation practice, I'm transferring the very best, say, of Greek authors from, into English, because if I were doing that, I would also be 90% I'm translating poetry. If I want to be fair, I should also translate drama, also translate novels, graphic novels, even, all the gamut of literary production. We cannot be, in our own practice and considering our own talents and proclivities, we cannot be as objective as we would perhaps desire to be. But there is a selection process. There is a a sense in which the translation begins with the selection of the text to be translated before the very first sentence or verse or stanza is being translated. There's a choice. I'm going to translate this poem rather than this poem. That's a massive, you know, that's a switch that you flick or you don't flick, and it makes the world of difference between the reception of one poet or another, in English or in Greek, or makes enormous difference. So there's this, and I think the last part of your question was the how worthwhile is it to have creative writing practice for translators? Was that it? Well, yeah. So first of all, it builds confidence to begin with. I mean, we tend to be, you know, I used to be. I mean, and you still are. You're starstruck. This is someone with whose you've invested, you know, your soul is in this. You read a book and you identify with the characters, and you invest in someone's literary production to an extent that you know, it's like meeting a famous actor and being very worried about asking for their autograph. So on a purely, let's put it this way, on a purely psychological level, you need translators and writers to be as close as and in dialogue, and things will come through that contact. I mean, maybe I'm a writer and I don't know where to start looking for a translator. Maybe I asked my publisher and the publisher is clueless. So if I'm in an environment, whether this is an academic environment or a literary festival, and I have a translator on the other side of the room, maybe I will approach them, and I need them, you know, as much as they need me. So that's important as a setting.
Yes.
On the other hand, consider the simple fact that when I translate, it helps if and let me just go to take a step back and say this. I also lead a creative writing seminar at my university in Corfu. It's not intended. It's not a fully fledged creative writing seminar. It doesn't traverse many semesters. It's 10 or 15 meetings, but we go through enough literary exercises to also cover the aspect of practice, because obviously we mentioned criticism before. The grounding you also need students to have, because they might come to us bilingual. They might, their English and their Greek might be amazing, and they might have nearly no awareness of a history of dialogues between two literary traditions. You need the sort of grounding. I mean, that's so self-evident. I don't know if I should even waste time saying this, but you should have the student of literary translation should also be sort of an English major, you know, or a modern Greek major. You should have, and we try to do this. The thing with our issue, let's put it this way, one weakness I would communicate at this point in our case, in the case of my university, in my department in Corfu, is that sometimes you come to the study of translation like I did at MA level after you had like 3 years studying English or studying modern Greek. In our case, it's because it's an undergraduate degree, so we have workshops after workshops and for several years. So abilities in terms of translation, and we don't, I mean, it's not just literary translation, we also all kinds, okay, and we have a second degree in interpreting, so it's the focus is there. So the problem sometimes is that we need to very quickly, in the space of a few weeks, give students a crash course in English literature and in modern Greek literature before they even are able to apply their considerable abilities in translation. In my case, I mean, my own courses start from the third year, so they've already done enough translation to be able to. But it's literature is a code, in a sense, within the code of language. So if you're not aware of the conventions and the genres and the history of literature and the way some of these exchanges have already taken place, the way that we have haikus in Greek, since when and how? It's not something that developed from the Greek language. It comes from elsewhere, or the sonnet, for instance. So unless I become aware that my own literature is already a word literature, there's already a significant amount of exchanges and dialogue and internalizations and revoicings and further attempts and development of a genre or of something that has a different origin in another language and develop it I mean, unless I'm aware of that, you cannot then argue why translation is important. Okay, in that sense, the student might come to you and say, okay, can I make money off this? Is it important? How? Unless sometimes they are lovers of literature and they're very enthused already, but you need to also instill a sense of the literature that is already translational in many respects before it even comes to the point that I would need to render a novel from Greek to English or from English to Greek. So, sorry, I took a detour there. I don't know if I
yeah. Just listening to Paschalis talk with such passion about translation and such deep understanding of literature and language, I think your students are really fortunate to have you. You know, your sensibility about that and your understanding of the need to communicate that literary sensibility to the students and how they won't be able to be literary translators. They might be able to translate, they might know the language very well, but to really understand the whole spirit of the language, of both languages, to understand the spirit of the languages and to understand the spirit of the work, the profound nature of the style that you're looking at, to communicate all of that to the students. It must be no easy thing, but it is a very important.
I don't know if I could claim that it's as hard to teach as creative writing, but it's something. I mean, you get better at it, and you become more experienced, and you get to sense more quickly what works and what doesn't work, in terms of examples. But the difficulty is always that you're trying to develop too many, well, not too many, several skills and abilities at the same time, and often it takes years before some of these this sort of awareness that you might try to include in the space of 2 or 3 semesters kind of unfolds in the real life of a literary translator later on. So you're trying to have an understanding of literary criticism and of literary history, and of course also develop their translation ability. And we're talking not just, I mean, when we say literary translation, it's not, in my case, for instance, knowledge of Greek and of English. It's how creatively both languages are used. I mean, in the original, and how creative one has to be in exactly, not necessarily in producing a poetic translation or some sort of a imitation or an experimental sort of a version of something, to be faithful and to actually use all the those stereotypes and some of these words are cliche or have a bad reputation. But there is a contract that you sign, like I don't mean in the
I know,
literal
not
extensive. And yeah,
translated.
so if I translate your work, I cannot hijack it. It has to be your name, you know, my abilities as a translator, but it has to be your sensibility, your voice, and to be able to transport this voice in a language that it did not create it. You need, by necessity, you need to be creative in terms of how you find analogies and models and how you render wordplay. So creativity is there from day one. And on the conversely, if you move on over on the other side, I mean, writers are also readers, and sometimes this reading takes the form of translation. It takes the form of imitation. It takes the form of, in poetry especially, I mean, we see this in poetry especially, but it's not absent from other forms and other genres. I mean, we didn't always have police procedurals and crime fiction in Greek.
Yes.
So what happens is that some of the you have translations or certain schools of within a genre. You have the Scandinavian, the sort of, you know, the Swedish authors. So some of these, there's mimicry. There is a sense of remodeling something, just changing, you know, using basic tenets of the plot and characters and their attitude to life, let's say, and then remodeling that somehow and transferring it to a Greek setting. And that could be an original crime novel written in Greek, but it's also, in a sense, partly a translation. It's an unspoken translation, it's a partial translation, it's a translation in inverted commas and in the most wide and general sense of the word, but still there.
I think that's a perfect example of what is meant by cultural translation. And indeed, the full name of the centre is the Centre for Literary and Cultural Translations, and I think that's a very, very good example of that. I'll have.
Can I ask you, Deirdre? Can I just ask you this? You're also teaching creative writing.
Yes.
Yes. So I always wonder. I mean, in some respects, in my case, you know, I write poems from time to time. It's somehow you get so busy that you're, you know, even though you're teaching the subject, even though you do less and less of it in some respects. I wanted to, I mean, obviously that's not the case with you. I mean, you do write. I wanted to ask this: does the experience of teaching creative writing, does it also somehow change, inspire you in some respects, creates idea, you know, fosters ideas that weren't there or would not be there if it wasn't for teaching? Or is it like a completely separate? Do you also draw on that experience?
If I do, I think I do it in quite an unconscious way. I don't think it certainly wouldn't have informed in terms of subject things that I have, written. I think that in terms maybe of like revision and editing, I'm probably sharper at that than I was, because I do an awful lot of that with the students. So maybe in that respect, that is the case.
That's important. I think I'm asking this because I'm aware of a couple of Greek authors who teach creative writing, who lead seminars in Athens, and I can see in their later work evidence. That's the word I'm after. Evidence of studying creative writing. somehow it enters their own it enters their own practice. I'm not sure if they're even aware of it. I think I see it as reader, but also the editing is already important though there. I mean the editing and redrafting and revising this is kind of, it's important to convey that as well. It's important to convey to literary translators, because somehow many come to us and feel that the first draft it works, and that's very naive, of course, and it's very it doesn't happen for the so you have to transmit the understanding that it doesn't even happen for the author. It's not that there's some sort of a divine inspiration and everything comes out. Most novels and poems worth their salt have been rewritten, and it's not just that. And I wanted to ask you this as well: how's your relationship with other writers? I mean, the other idea I wanted to explore is the dialogue, because we did this in Corfu, is the dialogue between writers, is the exchange of ideas and perspectives and the sense of community. And not just, I mean, obviously in our case, we had, there was 4 of you, 4 prose writers from Ireland and 4 from Greece. So there was already the expectation of intercultural and a dialogue between literary traditions. But even on the level of the 4 of you, in one language and in one, just practicing writers within a literary tradition, is there dialogue? Is there are you following each other's work? Is there reviewing or editing each other's books? Sometimes this happens as well.
For myself, I wouldn't be looking at other people's work apart from the students I'm looking at. I want to get to the chat in a minute and see what questions are there. I want to leave time to have a look at those. But to answer your question, Paschalis, a thing that came out in the conference that I want to mention that I really appreciated, Mia Gallagher was a wonderful presence at this conference, and she made wonderful comments. And one of the things she said that I've really taken up.
While we say this, Deirdre, let me just quickly point to our audience that I'm going to be going through 2 slides that mention Mia Gallagher while you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. A thing that Mia mentioned is that when she's teaching creative writing, she says a thing people often get wrong is they start revising too soon. They start going back over, and she said you need to get enough like raw material out there and then go back. And so people are getting anxious because they can't pull the work together, but there isn't enough work there to pull together, if you see what I mean. And it sounds strange, but that had never really struck me. And I think that was a really good thing to say to students. And how as I say, I really took that on board, and a lot. And I do hope everybody at the conference or at the event today, this is really a book that is well worth getting your hands on. Be you interested in writing or translation or both. And a lot of the writers said very, very interesting things, and that was one I took from Mia. I do want, because we're under slight pressure.
It does happen. Let me just complete your sentence here in a way. It does. There's. I think it applies. You have cases of literary critics who are extraordinary and have like an internal knowledge of literature and how to read literature. Their abilities might be amazing, and they cannot write. It's because sometimes the mind becomes so critical, and it's not the students. So you have this, and because you know too much about it, about the subject, in a sense, you cannot really be creative in it. Yes. Sometimes it happens. There's a sense of self-censorship and being self-critical and self-aware to that extent that it stifles the creative. I fully agree with what Mia said. Let me very quickly also go through that bit of dialogue here at the end. And I think what she means is that you need to editing. You have to have the material to edit. That's obviously to go through different layers of the work, different drafts of the work. You have to have that material out there. It's impossible to do it, to start thinking too far ahead about the structure and the fully developed writing as not just.
Yes.
It has to be exercising a muscle at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about what you write as some sort of needs to be a masterpiece inside the literary tradition and part of a literary system, and something that needs, that's a very heavy, very heavy groundwork.
Yeah, you will close yourself down before you've even got started.
But let me quickly, while you are you going through some of the questions?
There's one.
I cannot see them now.
There's one that is very interesting that I'll read. Please bear with us. I am very bad at multitasking and talking to Paschalis and looking at
and I don't. Let me quickly also help you here, Deirdre, because I don't. I think I need to stop sharing the screen.
Okay, that's fine. I will read out a question Eve has posted, which I think is very helpful. She has asked, did the distinctive island geography of the Greek setting for the conference lend itself in any way to an Irish interest? I'm thinking of a long list of classical Greek scholars, such as George Thompson, who found a second home in the West Coast Irish Islands. I'll talk about that very briefly and then pass to Paschalis. I mean, I think there are, when I first came into this area and I thought like Ireland, Greece, I have to confess, I thought they were two completely different countries. And the more I thought about it and read about it and considered it, the more you realize there are similarities. The whole archipelago in Greece, the importance, the huge cultural importance of the islands in Ireland, the Aran Islands, the Blasket Islands, in the whole deep culture in the literature as well. The interaction, I mentioned Joanna Kruszkowska earlier. She's written a really interesting book, which we actually launched in Trinity a couple of years ago, about the influence of Greece on Irish poets such as Deirdre Madden, for example. So I'll just read that very briefly again, Paschalis, and ask you to comment on that. Did the distinctive island geography of the Greek setting for the conference lend itself in any way to an Irish interest? I'm thinking of the long list of classical Greek scholars such as George Thompson, who found a second home in the West Coast Irish Islands.
Following the conference, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not aware of something. We tried and we did. We were successful in this. I mean, there were discussions. There was the round table at the end. You had a very brief snippet from that text as well as published in the book, and there was a sense of understanding and a sense of participating in the other culture, and there was a sense of finding common ground as well in how I think that the title of Joanna's piece is At the Edges of Europe.
That's right. Yeah.
So there are parallels and there are contrasts and there are things discussed. Whether this arrived at creative material and setting, I wouldn't know at this point. I don't think so far. I mean, there might be something that one of these 8 novelists is writing at this point that hasn't been published, but I haven't seen something yet. What I could say is that the island setting is very important, not just in the case of Corfu, but in the case of Corfu, obviously you have many British expatriates there. So some of them have an activity as writers. They do their reading groups. There's and there's of course the example of the Darrells as well. So that's
absolutely, yes.
That's too obvious to mention. So you do have dialogues. It's for a small island. There's a lot of literature happening. That much I can say. Now, whether something tangible resulted from the conference itself, I think certain things, certain perspectives will remain with people, but not necessarily something that would be too obviously evident in their current work. Maybe, or maybe not. I would say that Panos Karnezis' last book does, very briefly, it connects to the migrant crisis in Greece. So that was something that was, discussed as well. So I can see, and there, what I would like to very, very quickly point out is that part of the part of the book that struck me, I mean, I was impressed by, was indeed the revised submissions of the reflective pieces, because I could see aspects of a writer's critical apparatus and their self-awareness and how they understand their own work that was either present already or further developed because we asked them, we asked you, Deirdre, to just write a few words on, why I write. So many of these reflections, I was so pleasantly surprised to see. I mean, Christos Chrissopoulos was reflecting on the positions of philosophy within literary creativity. Panos Karnezis, who writes in English, if I don't remember mentioning this before, so his originals are in English. So he was talking about exophonic writing. So if I ask you on that very basic level, if I ask you to reflect on your writing rather than just write, this reflection perhaps will fine-tune somehow, make you more sensitive to some parts of identity that you're unconsciously, that are there, but you're more consciously aware of them now. So that was the perhaps for me the part of the book that was most enjoyable to compile, and also, of course, for our students, because that was a very key component in the process. I mean, they were translating in groups, so there was the aspect of collaborative translation. They could observe each other doing this work, and in the end, we managed, with some help from me as well. I mean, in editing some of these translations, we managed to have a bilingual text appear within that book. So we have an excerpt from your novel, for instance, Deirdre, and then you have a translation by the students, the names of the students underneath. And it's, I mean, for me, I'm after so many years in the field and after several publications, it's not, but for someone who's starting out, it's a very important thing, and it's a very joyous occasion if it happens. And can I also say this? I mean, a couple of the stories in the book appear for the first time in this publication. There's a story by Panos Karnezis that has not appeared so far. He was going to do, I think, a selection of stories. It hasn't appeared yet, so first publication remains in the bounds of this book. So there's so many roles, and I'm not going to say that we were entirely successful in any, in all of these parts of this ambitious structure. But I think there's something to say about a book that also includes original writing that is as yet unpublished as well. So that's a bonus.
Yes. I'm glad you. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I have to check some of the questions as well. All right. I'm going to. Okay, Ethan, I'm now seeing your comments, so apologies.
I think we only have a minute.
We have very few. Yeah, we have a couple of minutes.
So
okay. Let me quickly. How do you pronounce Padraig or O'Connor?
Padraig O'Connor.
Padraig O'Connor. Oh,
mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jude. I would never have gotten this right. Is this happening now? Classic. That's from Michael
Cronin, I think.
Okay, so I'm gonna make a note of that. That's very interesting.
Yes.
And also about the selection, I mean, I think let me very briefly point this out. We try to have a variety of novelists to sort of discover a range that avoided the obvious, people who were too successful, let me put it this way, and did not need necessarily the help. Well, I wouldn't say it this way, but we wanted to have people who were already being translated. For instance, I think 2 of your books, Deirdre, am I correct?
Yes.
And also someone like Paraic O'Donnell, who also only had a debut novel at that point.
Yes.
There was no so we try to have people from the outset of their careers and
range, yes,
a range, but avoid someone who was who had a Nobel Prize or someone who did not. So that was part of our thinking, and of course it's also a practical issue as well. I mean, you have to adjust to dates, to people's other obligations. Sebastian Barry was supposed to be part of this at some point.
Then couldn't.
Get a prize, and it was less. Yeah.
Paschalis, sorry to cut across you. I can see that we're right up to time, and I know that because it's a lunchtime reading, people will be needing to go. But I do want to thank you very much for that, Paschalis. I think you've given us a tremendous sense both of the conference, of the book. You've raised some very interesting.
Thank you. This would not have been the same without you. Absolutely. And I'm going to apologize to the few folks who asked a couple of questions here, and we got to questions a bit late. So
likewise, as I say,
I'll make a note of these and
touch of everything. But thanks very, very much to everybody who came to the event today. Many thanks to James and for asking us, James and Ethna in the Centre for Literary Translation. And thank you all very much indeed. It's been a really enjoyable session to take part on, and I hope you've enjoyed it all as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Absolutely was. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Just before we finish up, let me just take 1 minute of your time to say, yes, as you said many times, this is an event brought to you by the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation. And if you enjoyed the event, then please do follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can see the link on your page, on your screen just now. And we also have a website where you can see all of the upcoming events that we have in the centre. And if you really enjoyed the event, then please do consider becoming one of the friends of the centre, where you can get all sorts of perks and get a bit closer to us. So with that said, we'll look forward to seeing you next time at one of our events. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.